Hello everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to today's seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE. My name is Dr. Shalini Grover, if you can see me, and I'm an anthropologist and a research fellow at the III. I'm incredibly pleased to be chairing today's seminar titled Social Reproduction and Domestic Service, an International Comparison, which is part of our III Inequalities seminar series. And I'm also incredibly pleased to be introducing you all to Dr. Marion Lieutaud and Dr. Paul Segal. I'll introduce Paul first, and he's also come with his partner, Ingrid, who's here with us today. Paul is Reader in Economics of Development at the Department of International Development at King's College London. He's an affiliated scholar at the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality, CUNY, and the III as well. His research focuses on global inequality and poverty and on structural approaches to inequality within developing countries. And he also works on interdisciplinary approaches to socio-economic inequality and is currently working on linkages between inequality and social reproduction. So thank you, Paul, and a very warm welcome. Marion, who's with us here, is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Methodology at LSE and a visiting fellow at the III and at Science Po's Observatory of Social Change. She currently holds an Understanding Society Fellowship and was previously an LSE Fellow in Computational Social Science. In 2022, she was awarded a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship for her project Care to Join Us on how international migration shapes women's paid and unpaid labor, which will start in 2023. So a very warm welcome to you as well, Marion. A very big thank you also to Alpa, who could not be here today, but will hopefully be online. And a very big thank you to Peter, Emma, and Saga for helping us organize this. May I ask the audience to keep themselves muted, those who are online, and put their videos on wherever possible. There'll be a chance for you to ask questions later. The next event in our III seminar series is called The Impact of Caste and Untouchability, a Missing Link in the Literature on Stunting in India. And it'll take place at the same time next Tuesday, 22nd November. So now I'm delighted to hand you over to Marion and Paul, and many thanks, and please enjoy the event.
So hello, thanks to the III for allowing us to present this research. It's the first time we present on it. It's a project we've been working on for about a year and a half together, and then Paul started somewhat before that. This is the structure of the presentation. The general reasoning behind the result that I'll walk you through as we go is we start with a sort of macro picture of domestic workers, like proportion of domestic workers in a selection of countries. We try to see whether that links with unpaid work provision in those same countries. And then we go into the more micro level, where we actually look at access and distribution of that paid domestic work between households across the income distribution. Right, so the general idea is to sort of understand how domestic work and inequality connect and might not just sort of like presuppose, but also exacerbate inequality. So if you think of domestic work, you're kind of assuming already several types of inequalities, right? The inequality between employer and employee that allow some household to employ other people's labor to help them with their social reproduction. And this kind of inequality is both social and economic, because it's not just whether you can afford it, it's also about how that paid domestic work might be itself a form of social distinction, a form of like class feature. And then the second type of inequality is the inequality between households, between those who can and those who can't afford it, right? And behind that, there's the inequality in how households perform social reproduction. That connects to a whole lot of discussions about the crisis of care, about like the fact that in some contexts you can have a multiplicity of ways to do your social reproduction, you can outsource it and so on, and in some contexts you're going to have to rely quite heavily on like the unpaid work of women, of family members, and so on and so forth. It might be best here to define social reproduction. We understand it quite broadly, like within social reproduction theory, as the work that goes into reproducing labor power, right? That includes domestic work, that includes care work, emotional work, potentially all sorts of reproductive work. And it's a work that by definition is split, it's going to be split between the households where that work is mostly done unpaid and informally, overwhelmingly by women, the state in the collectivized or public form of social reproduction, subsidized more, and then the market where you might be able to get privatized form of paid help to come into your home. Right. The question here, we focus specifically on that last form, like privatized sort of market mediated work, and we focus on domestic work. So we leave aside, we tried to look at care work as well. It was complicated and there was a lot to say about this. So we focus on domestic work for this presentation. Domestic work, and the link between domestic work and domination has been discussed for a long time. You can go back as far as Rousseau to sort of think about how basically the moment that you have the ability to command someone else's labor for your own personal purposes and consumption, you're already in a relation of like, that is already really constitutive of social inequality. And domestic work in particular has been described as a sort of very like extreme form of domination, like that relationship of domination that happens in those close quarters without accountability in the private relationship between employer and employee. And in that context, it's really important to understand what's happening with domestic work in different countries and in the context of inequality. Now, domestic work is also something that works really well, or like is particularly interesting to think about if you think about inequality, not just in terms of some people have more and some people have less, but also the fact that having more can mean that you've a greater entitlement over the labor of other people, and specifically that you become able to pay them, like employ them to do whatever you might need. And in this context, the level of economic inequality and the ability for wealthier people to pay for others to serve them become really closely related, right? It's a sort of it's a different lens to consider inequality. And it derives from that if you have low inequality, that should imply that domestic work is more expensive because people at the top have relatively less money, or they have more, but not as much more, right? And high inequality should mean that domestic work is cheaper because if you're at the top, you have so much more money, you can buy several people's work. And what we're testing here is the idea that how straightforwardly does that actually work? Is it that when you have lower inequality, you just have less domestic work, right? That's the whole discussion of the presentation. In terms of literature review, we're building on there's really rich qualitative, often ethnographic work on domestic workers. typically focused on the experiences of domestic workers and the sort of more like the effective labor and effects-based relationship between domestic workers and employers. Roughly speaking, I think that literature sort of sorts itself into two maybe main strands, which is the elite study strands and the analysis of domestic workers in elite environments, and then the global care chain literature, which is the more migrant domestic workers, and tries to think a bit more about how that is, you know, in the context of global inequality and transfers of cares and so on. But all of this literature, while it's really amazing literature and we build on it a lot, it's mostly focused on a particular kind of domestic work and domestic workers, which is typically single employer, typically full-time, and often in-house with those lenses of migrant and elite environment. On the quantitative side, you have some analysis in terms of time used mainly, which is the allocation of domestic tasks between household members. The problem with that is that very often the questions are phrased in, you've probably come across these questions like, who does the cleaning more often? And then people can pick mostly me, mostly my partner, mostly someone else. Obviously you don't know who that someone else is. And in some surveys you have paid help only, which then is specifically paid domestic work, but comes with its own problem because it really underestimates the extent to which people resort to paid domestic work, because you're only going to pick that category if you literally never do that task, right? And most of the time people consider that they're still doing most of the cleaning, they just get some help sometimes, right? So that's the time use side, which is most of the evidence. It's also connected to like a broader discussion about the extent to which paid domestic work might help women in particular, women's capacity to stay in employment, and to some extent even gender equality. So there's some discussions about how maybe if you can use paid domestic work to outsource some of that labor of social reproduction, then you're going to have a more egalitarian, that's going to be the key to more egalitarian distribution of the labor that's left, right? That's not really working, but like not clearly in the data, but that's this, it's this conversation, which isn't exactly what we're talking about, and it's more about allocation. And so overall, we have this like map of research, and what we're trying to do is a bit in the middle of that, but it falls straight into an area of relative statistical invisibility, which we're not the first one to point out, which means that domestic work domestic work as like a mass of work, as a labor, is mostly underestimated or even sometimes absent for survey data, and that domestic workers, in the sense of the people who engage in paid domestic work, not just the people whose main primary employment is domestic work, are also often underestimated, right? So to answer this empirical problem, we triangulate, so we use 3 sources of data. The International Labour Organization estimates on the shared domestic workers, time use data on unpaid housework that we get from the International Social Survey programs, the family and gender role modules, and then most importantly, perhaps we use expenditure data from the generation and gender surveys, combined with the Mexican expenditure survey. The generation and gender survey is a European program. We included Mexico because we wanted it as a point of analysis. And we focus on this 7 European countries for a number of reasons. One is they give us an interesting sort of sample. We have Eastern European countries and we have Western European countries. And the other reason is that the GGS data is not fantastically harmonized, and a lot of variables are present in some countries and not others. And these were the countries where we had both data on household income and data on paid domestic work. Right. The variable that we use for this, maybe this is important, is a variable. It's a question that's asked that is, do you regularly pay someone to do housework? Right. This is a question that you don't find very often, and it's the one where we felt we would be least likely to underestimate. Like, it would capture also casual casual sort of like forms of labor, and not just full-time. Right. This is our sample size. The first column is the one that mixes the GGS and the Mexican expenditure survey. So that's why the Mexican sample is so much bigger. And so, and yeah, the ISSP samples are smaller per country, but enough to work with. Right. So without further ado, this is just a very straightforward scatter plot between a classic measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, and the employment share of domestic workers. So the proportion of domestic workers in the workforce in each country, right? We just projected that, and already at first glance, you can see there's something like a linear positive relationship that suggests when the Gini increases, so when you have higher inequality, you have a higher share of domestic worker, right? If we look at our sample, our selection of countries more specifically, this still works, right? Mexico has the highest Gini by quite a bit, and it has the highest share of domestic worker. France has a higher Gini than Belgium and Germany, slightly higher share of domestic worker. It doesn't work across the selection though, because Russia, for instance, has got a high Gini, no domestic workers, as far as the International Labour Organization estimates can tell us. But still, the overall narrative seems to be like quite consistent in this very like rough way, right? We try unpaid housework. So this is the same selection of countries, and this is now the hours spent weekly in unpaid housework. You have women for women here and for men here, and you see something like in countries where you have very few domestic workers, it seems that people do a little bit more unpaid housework, right? In France, that had like more domestic workers relative to Belgium and Germany. Seems that they do a little bit less unpaid housework. So far we have something like a consistent story. Mexico is a bit weird, but it still seems to sort of say something that makes sense. And when we plot it, we find the same thing. So this is the share of domestic workers, and this is the housework hours spent in unpaid housework, and you have something that kind of looks like a negative linear relationship, where it's more unpaid housework that suggests that you have a lower share of domestic workers in your country, right? So if you think in terms of social reproduction, it kind of seems like something that's straightforwardly more paid domestic work, less unpaid housework, and vice versa, right? Right, but now we change the way we look at domestic work, and instead of measuring who declares themselves to be domestic workers, we look at the proportion of households that say they use paid domestic work regularly, right? And then we have a completely different picture, because where you expected Mexico to have a massive proportion of domestic worker and therefore domestic work use, Mexico is actually not that high at all. Suddenly it's Belgium that has a very high proportion of households that say they regularly use paid domestic work, right? So what we're looking at here, you still get these three countries, the Eastern European countries, perfectly consistent, no domestic workers in the workforce, nobody uses paid domestic work. But these countries are quite different, right? And then Mexico is also not where we expected, and Belgium is just completely outsider. What we did then is we split this to understand how is this paid domestic work used split across the income distribution. And we found this. We got the mean here. This you expected, right? Mexico, Austria, France, and Germany are showing distribution where basically the paid domestic work is a clear distinctive feature of the top of the income distribution. It's very classed. You use paid domestic work, you're quite likely to use paid domestic work, right? 20%, 40%, 30% of people in the top 10% use paid domestic work regularly. It's a common thing, right? But it's a common thing only in those top 10%, right? In Belgium, do something really different because this is huge, right? 50% of the people in the top 10% use paid domestic work regularly, but it's not limited to them. Now it's something that a lot of people do across the income distribution. It's still obviously class. You do it more when you have more money, but you can't really talk about something that is, you know, a sort of a means of class distinction in the same sense, right? Like something that is very specific to the top. So, in order to understand what's going on, we need to understand what's going on in Belgium, right? In Belgium, we have a voucher-based subsidy system of domestic work, right? Which means domestic work is actually much more affordable than just the cost of that it would take to hire someone as such for anything. If it's domestic work, it's subsidized, you pay about half of the actual cost of labor, right? The other thing is that when we look at domestic work use, we're looking at work that is potentially very split between a lot of different households. Maybe you're only using 2 hours of paid domestic work every 2 weeks, right? And so what we might be looking at is a situation where a lot of people use very little paid domestic work. And when we calculate that, put it into numbers, if we're combining the ILO estimates for full-time domestic workers and the proportion that we calculated with the GTS and Mexican expenditure survey, we get to this, right? In Belgium, you have 1 domestic worker per 100 households. That's based on the ILO estimate, right? Of these 100 households, we calculated 22 are paying regularly for housework. So that means on average, they're each paying for about 5% of the work of a domestic worker. And that comes down to about 2 hours of a 40-hour week, which is kind of in line with what you'd expect for a casual form of domestic work. What that means is that the overall mass of domestic work provided might not be huge, but it's split across a lot of households, right? And so a lot of households have access to paid domestic work, which means it's also a bit more evenly distributed. Okay. If you contrast this to Mexico, you have 9 domestic workers per 100 households. Of these 100 households, you have 6 that employ paid domestic work. That's what we calculated before. And that means on average, each employing household is getting the equivalent of 1.5 full-time domestic worker. That means like 1 full-time staff plus 1 part-time staff on average, right? To do your work every week. So this is a massive mass of domestic worker, but it's limited to the top. This is to sort of think further in terms of what that means for inequality. This is what I was just talking about. So the mass, 1 per 100 households for Belgium, 9 for Mexico, right? We just got it for all of the countries. And this is to give a sort of measurement of inequality in labor use. So you divide the proportion that use paid domestic work in the top 10% by the proportion in the overall population, right? And you get these kind of measurements. And there you find something that's consistent. Mexico is very high. France and Germany are quite high. Belgium, even though the use of domestic labor is huge, the difference between the top and the rest is not that big. Okay, so in conclusion, we find that in thinking about domestic work and the link between domestic work and inequality, there's a really key distinction to make between domestic work use and domestic work mass, right? If you have a lot of full-time domestic workers in the country, that's a huge mass of domestic labor. It might be completely focused at the top. The latter, so this domestic work mass, is strongly correlated with inequality, but not necessarily the first. Right? In terms of low inequality, we find 2 low inequality models. So it's not just the case that if you have low inequality, you have low domestic work overall. We find 2 models. So one where you basically no domestic work at all. That's the Eastern European model. And you have another model where you have very widespread use of domestic work. That is distributed somewhat more equally. What that means is that low inequality doesn't necessarily mean that domestic work disappears. It means that it changes form. It becomes split between households. It becomes maybe more casual, maybe more gig-based. It doesn't necessarily go away. Now, in terms of the discussion about domination, that might still be good, because the whole part of the theory of why domestic work is such a problem for domination and inequality is because of this personal relationship between employer and employee. Because of working in a single household, nobody knows what's happening. Your employer can do whatever they want. If you have multiple employers, maybe they can't do that anymore, and although that's still a good development. On the other hand, the gig economy and the more casual form of domestic work, they come with their own problem. It looks like it's becoming a big niche of underemployment, right? And then when it's mediated through platforms, that comes with its own form of power imbalance between the clients and the workers through the review system, the rating systems, and so on. Right? So that's the sort of conversation that we've mapped out. I just added a little point of caution because we still don't have perfect data for the gig and casual work, especially, and that will be particularly relevant for Western countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marion. That was really fantastic, and nothing like international comparisons, and that was really rich. So we're going to start off with questions from the audience and then online. So we're going to alternate a bit. So I've seen 3 hands. Okay, Armina, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Shalini. Thank you, Marion, for the presentation. My question is around the Eastern European countries, because, I mean, I've studied more qualitatively Eastern European and former socialist countries, and there's high levels of inequality in a lot of these countries. So I was wondering how you were interpreting the lack of use of domestic work. How would you kind of interpret these findings?
So there's a number of ways to look at it. I think it's got something to do with the care chains as well. That these countries are sending domestic workers to Western Europe in particular. And as sending countries, I think basically if you were to work as a paid domestic work, you might as well do that abroad. which I think plays a role here as to why you would have this contrast between, because you can think of like Bulgaria, Czech Republic, in particular in our sample, as sending countries in the care chain, and Belgium, France, and Germany as receiving countries. And so the fact that they would have more paid use of paid domestic work in one case and less in the other kind of makes sense in that context. But
just on that, I mean, have you also considered the cultural aspect? Because, you know, in terms of some of these countries, it's such stigmatized work that they prefer to go outside of their country to do that work. And so I don't know if that's something that you can capture or it's outside of this methodology.
So one interesting thing we found is that in the macro data, can you show us that first scatter plot, please? In the macro data, we find that those Eastern European countries aren't outliers. When you just look at inequality, just simply the Gini coefficient and employment share of domestic workers, except for Russia. Okay, so so obviously there's lots of Eastern European countries. The only ones we have in our zoomed in data are Czech Republic and Bulgaria, aren't they? But more generally, with a bigger sample, we kind of ran very simple regression. We put in regional dummies, tried all sorts of stuff, and the Eastern European countries, basically, on average, they do have much lower inequality than other regions, and that inequality pretty much explains all of the small share of domestic workers, with the exception of Russia, because Russia has a small share of domestic workers but high inequality. Why is an interesting question. One possibility, maybe it's just a lag, because it wasn't that long ago that it was low inequality, so maybe it takes time for a culture of domestic service to build up, but that's the one that we don't have an answer for.
Okay, interesting.
Okay. Our next question is online by Shiko, our director. So Shiko, go ahead.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thanks very much, Marion and Paul. This is very interesting. I have a boring question about your inequality data. So if I understood correctly, this ranking that you have on the screen now, Germany all the way to Mexico, is the order of your Gini coefficients from lowest to highest?
no, we just presented it that way because it allowed us to visually sort of show the groups.
I see. Right. But did you say, for example, that Austria had a higher inequality than Germany in the Czech Republic?
No, France has a higher Gini coefficient than Belgium and Germany. I think Austria is a bit in the middle of that. And the Czech Republic and Bulgaria are much lower. Russia is higher and Mexico is still higher.
Okay. No, yeah, because I was looking at the list data here on my screen, and yes, the Czech Republic is the lowest, followed by Belgium, and then Austria, I think, and then Germany. But I was wondering where you're getting your inequality data from. It's probably internal from your own data, right? And I was wondering whether you had checked the correlation between that and, say, for example, LSE, which is the comparable one that we often use.
I think we just used, so in the scatter plot above, I think we just used World Bank Gini coefficients because it has a lot more than LSE, right? LSE only covers a relatively small subset, and so it would be nice to we should label on this figure which are our specific countries of interest. But what I can tell you is that the only outlier among our 8 countries, the only outlier is Russia. Russia is the only one where it has much lower share of domestic workers than you'd expect given its Gini coefficient. The others aren't particular outliers in this relationship.
Yeah. Just as a suggestion presentationally, if you're really interested in this relationship between inequality and domestic work, and then you go down to that sample of your main countries in the next slide, however many there are, 9 or whatever, it'd be good to sort of also see those in a separate scatter plot, since you're drawing quite a lot out of those in order, so that we could see the sort of relationship between inequality and domestic work in that subsample. Maybe it's just me, it's early in the US, but I clearly misunderstood what the order there meant. But thanks.
You're quite right, thank you. And this is work in progress, and we're still working out how best what precisely the lines of argument are and how best to present them. And that's a good point. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Shiko. Kirsty, please go ahead.
Thank you. Loved your presentation. It's a topic that I've looked at myself in the past and really interesting to me. I just want to clarify one thing before I ask you some questions. When you say domestic work, you mean childcare, household, looking after the elderly, it's everything? Or was it just?
It's in this, so in the empirical analysis, it's specifically housework.
Just housework, okay.
Yeah.
So my questions are the following, because the data sets that you're using, I don't know. So I'm interested in whether these things could be examined, but they may not be given sample sizes. So I'll just throw a couple of things at you and you can tell me what you think. So the first question is this distinction between migrants and local workers. The second is, as countries, this is more relevant for Russia, like Paul was just saying, but also Mexico, maybe Bulgaria, as countries move along the development chain and develop more, the profile of domestic work changes very significantly from being full-time workers, domestic workers, who then become sort of more partial and work on an hourly basis. And so that changes quite a lot. But again, in those countries, it's very difficult to distinguish between what's childcare and what's domestic housework, because they often come as part of the same package. So I was wondering whether there's any way of distinguishing between that. And then the other thing is, in some of these countries, childcare and social services for the elderly or long-term care insurance give you a state support for those two things, which means that reduces your housework significantly. So if you have access, for example, to full childcare during the day, that creates an awful lot, from experience, creates an awful lot less of a mess at home. And the same thing for if you have social services that take care of elderly relatives, etc. So I'm wondering whether we can control for these kind of things. Also in part because I would expect some of these tendencies or trends or whatever to change very significantly depending on the age cohort of the population. So for example, if you're in Belgium and you have access to subsidized housework, is that for everyone? Is it for families with elderly people? Is it for families with children? How does that spread out? I would expect that sort of to affect the use of domestic work over the life cycle, as well as over the development cycle, regardless of the underlying inequalities in the countries. Sorry, that was a lot. I apologize.
Right, so thanks very much. These are some of these points we did try to address and then sort of moved away from. So like, there are several questions in the GGS. There's another question on, do you use outsourced, do you use institutionalized childcare? Paid for institutionalized childcare. It batches public childcare and private nanny babysitter thing. So we tried to work on that, and then in the end we were like, we just can't analyze it. We don't know whether people are just bringing, whether this is state support like public childcare or whether it's what we're trying to look at in terms of private childcare. So that, I mean, I really agree that like the housework is not like there's something a little bit artificial about isolating housework and only looking at that. The reason we did that is because there is no scheme to support, like there's no public provision of housework specifically. And so we thought that made the reasoning a little bit more straightforward. Although what you're saying about how there is still a relationship, right? It's true, if you provide childcare, then there's less housework and then there's less, you have less to do and less to outsource potentially. But that was the reason why we focused on that. In terms of the distinction between migrant and local workers, so I talked about it in the presentation of the field, but we don't make that distinction in the analysis. We just look at when the International Labour Organization estimate, they're surveys, they ask everyone that's there. We didn't take out migrant workers or anything like that. And when we look at domestic work use, it's the same thing. Like we don't actually know in those questions whether the who they're hiring to do the housework. So yeah, the Belgium subsidy system is, as far as I read a couple of things of that, as far as I understood, is not based on, it's not particularly progressive, like it's not a progressive system. It's a, it seems to apply whenever you, it came from, the policy was initially motivated to fight against the informal, like how informal the sector was, and to bring domestic work into formal employment by making this like super easy subsidized contract that people could get. So I don't think there was like a threshold. It's the same in France. You have the tax deduction system. So that wouldn't maybe be more of an issue in France, because then the people who would get tax deduction are the people who would pay tax. But at least in Belgium, I don't think that would bias what we're talking about.
I can add a detail on Belgium. It's true that it's not progressive, but there is a cap in the amount of money you can spend. And if you are elderly or you are a single mother, you have double cap. So your cap is double. This is the only progression I can see from the Belgian system.
Okay. Yeah, so that's true. I remember that it's only up to a number of hours, but there's no like eligibility. Yeah.
Sorry, just on that point, also in Germany, that's also institutionalized as part of the long-term care insurance. So if you're elderly, you have the right to a certain amount of housework undertaken for you by the state, by somebody employed by the state.
So what we're trying to do here basically is work out what we possibly can on the basis of comparable cross-country data that exist. So all the questions you're asking about, all these other ways of providing care, providing for social reproduction labor, they're super important. The data just don't exist. So let me just plug, that's what Ingrid and I are trying to do right now in Argentina. We're collecting new survey data precisely to get all those different ways that households do it. So here we, in terms of the different income deciles, looking at what share of each income decile regularly pays for domestic work. That's basically the best we can do with the existing data. So it's a whole other project to try and collect the full multidimensional data on all the different ways that households can get help with their social reproduction.
There's a next question for you online, if that's done, yeah? Okay, the next question is from Bozina, and the question is, where do the outcomes of your research take you? Legislation, policy, or theoretical?
I mean, there's a number of things, right? One is, I think, if what we're looking at, especially looking at it from the UK or Western European countries, if what we're looking at is a system where you can have both low inequality and high paid domestic work, or like quite standard use of paid domestic work, then that means we should really think about legislating better on how to regulate this, because like this labor, like I don't know, in Belgium they might have succeeded in bringing some of it into formal employment, but my understanding of the policy was that it wasn't that successful. In that, not in capturing most of the paid domestic work, anyways. And then this development towards like more split and more casual work, that brings about a lot of questions. Like domestic workers already fall through the gaps of policy very often. Like the only policy we have for them are mainly focused on elite employment, like domestic worker visas, this kind of things. And so we already know that these people are not adequately protected by employment rights and so on when they're hired full-time by people. And that seems like that's even more vulnerability already. That's a policy angle that I'd be worried about. But more broadly, I just think we need, like, it's a real question in general, like, do we want to be societies that use a lot of paid domestic work? Is that like a model that we want to have? Because clearly that can happen even when even when inequality is quite low. And there's not like one position on this. Like we can, we discuss it with Paul, there's one side that's like, well, if paid domestic work is proper, like formalized, decent, employment, then there's nothing wrong with it. It's just normal employment. I guess I'm a bit more on the side of like, I think there's still quite a strong relation of domination involved in that, and like it's not removed by making it more casual or platformed or anything like that. So I don't know, does that answer?
Yeah, definitely. Valentina, please go next.
Thank you. So I wonder, it's very interesting to see all of these facts against inequality in general, but I really wonder what happens with women laborers for participation, for instance, in these countries, and someone is doing this work, right? Independently if we're using paid domestic work or unpaid domestic work, someone is doing the domestic work. So I wonder what's the difference in Belgium and Bulgaria with what's happening with either hours worked by women in the labor force, or if there is no difference in hours worked, at least in hours of leisure, right? So, because this is definitely a gender thing, right? We're talking here about domestic workers, most of them are women, right? And most of the times, women are doing much more unpaid domestic work actually too. So there are definitely gender issues that are also arising, and that there are differences between these countries that it would be super interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of linking to like that previous question for me. Like, I think one of the issues with paid domestic work relative to like unpaid housework is that we formalize the system through a work contract, ideally, but it's still women and women of color and migrant women doing the work, right? Like ultimately, that's still the division of labor. So that's part of the issue with having models where paid domestic work becomes really prevalent. I think that it doesn't necessarily question the gender division of labor. I don't know exactly what if I understood right, the start of the question was like, what is the impact for women employment?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And hours of leisure, if there is no impact in employment, then there is impact on hours of leisure because someone is doing this work.
Yeah. So that's more, there's like a bit more literature on that. It's an important point. It's a little bit tangential to what we were trying to do. This is more like the time use literature. So like there's some empirical quantitative literature that looks specifically as when you outsource domestic work, what happens to the labor that remains? And then also, does the outsourcing of domestic work actually benefit women in terms of continuous employment when they have children, in terms of like general labor market integration and so on? So that, I think that would be the literature that you'd want to look at if you're interested in more details on that specifically. A very crude summary is that when this is my understanding of the conclusion of that literature, when you outsource when you outsource housework in particular, you diminish the total number of hours of housework that a household has to do. But so women do less, but men also do less, and so the gender division of labor remains generally quite skewed. And then the argument is like, yeah, but it's already good if women do less. But then if the paid domestic work is undertaken by women at societal level, what's the benefit? I don't know.
So does that mean that in Bulgaria versus Belgium, is that women are just working more? They're working more at home and also working the same at the workforce?
Down, that one. No, up to. So that's what this one shows. This does show, I mean, it's only 8 data points, right? Clearly, it's very few countries that we have this data for, but it shows a very clear negative correlation between the number of housework hours done and the share of households that employ domestic workers. Now, that big outlier over on the right is Belgium. So what that shows us is Belgium has a normal number of housework hours, relatively low among this sample, but not nearly as low as you'd expect given the share of households employing domestic workers. So that's, stuff
Yeah,
to be
the
discovered.
big neat thing though is that how much work those women are doing in the labor force, and that's what's the total number of hours.
So you-
Unpaid.
Right, so you're raising kind of a big normative question there. Kind of what's not, is it like better or is one something better or worse? Authors is that if that's somewhat, if it's professionalized and you've got multiple employers, then it's no worse than lots of other jobs, and it's then basically normatively, in my personal opinion, that's probably okay, but that's just an opinion.
Valentina, there's also, sorry, I'm.
Nora had
sorry.
I had two questions, sorry, and the second one was exactly the
Can I
same.
also just 1 sec? There's also the radical Marxist feminist view that the minute you outsource, you break the sisterhood. And I haven't come across any feminist Marxist arguments coming up here. But that's, oh, anyway.
Marion's controlling herself.
Yeah, we have to go online before I give it to Nora, I'm sorry. Yeah? There's a question here from Sujata Modi saying, erstwhile socialist countries did not have a market for domestic workers. However, in market economies, there's a different attitude to labor domination and control, therefore a market. Is that something that you agree with, or any comment?
Yeah, I mean, we can't really test that hypothesis specifically with this data, but there certainly is evidence that, like, in other aspects of gendered work and gender equality, like former Soviet countries that continue to be outliers and have like slightly less gendered market, slightly less gendered division of labor. So that could be one angle of interpretation.
They weren't colonized. We haven't brought in colonialism here, which is a very important angle to the way domestic service got completely complexed and changed in so many countries. But anyway, Nora?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for the presentation, very interesting. I had 2 points, and the second point was exactly the one Valentina already raised, to focus a little bit more on the labor market attachment of women, and to make the cross-country story a little bit more convincing, also to show whether women are, like, not only the number of women in employment, but also what kind of employment, right? And whether they are working part-time or not, because that varies hugely across countries and is also strongly related to income inequalities. The second point I had is more, I mean, I know the pitfalls with cross-country analysis, then you usually run out of longitudinal data, but if you want to make a story about inequality and care work, and how this is related over time, I think it would be worthwhile to take 2 or 3 countries, and there is longitudinal data on income distributions and care work and different forms of care work, and then check whether in times of rising inequalities, this outsourcing increases and in which domains. I know that with the German socioeconomic panel, you should be able to do that actually. And you have a time where inequality was rising between 1999 and 2005, and then you could actually look in how far that changed domestic work. And I think with Austria, it showed us just 2 suggestions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that would be great. Like, I fully agree with all of that. Like, we looked at understanding society to see if we could do something with that, but the questions that we need on that, I put one in the innovation panel, so we'll have data on that next year. But for now, we just don't have it. Like, not a question that's general enough to capture like casual use, you know.
Innovation panel of what, sorry?
The understanding society innovation panel.
Okay. There's also an innovation panel for the GSOP exactly with care work questions.
Okay.
2 years ago or 3 years ago.
Okay. And with this kind of phrasing, like, do you pay for care work, or like, do you pay for housework?
And or care for elderly, and very specifically what kind of care?
Oh, that's really
So,
good.
I mean, I haven't worked with the data myself, but I saw some analysis.
No, that's really good. But was it a once-off then?
Sorry?
Was it a once-off? Like, did they ask that only at one wave?
That was only asked, like very detailed, it was only asked in one way, but they have the general questions about outsourcing and housework as well.
Okay.
And time use data, very detailed as well. for multiple years, and the SERP is running since 84. I don't know if they have it since 84, but you definitely have a long coverage of more general questions and then very detailed one in the innovation sample from 3 years ago or something.
I don't know the German socioeconomic panel.
I can give you the people who did that.
So we don't have any more questions online, but we have another one here. Please go
Yeah,
ahead.
so first of all, echo everything everyone said. I think it was a brilliant presentation. I've learned quite a lot. My question was about is there a difference between asking care workers about the situation versus the people who are employing care workers? Because there seems to be, some of this I think relies on basically asking effectively employers what their care circumstances are. So I think one of your later ones, for example, you talk about, you kind of infer the hours worked from it, and I thought that was really interesting. You've basically done that, am I right in saying you've done that by kind of looking at aggregate data on domestic workers per 100 households, but that you can't get the data presumably on what actual workers are saying, and they might say something different, they might say something the same, and I suppose how do you kind of unpack that? I suppose it's a challenge, because in Belgium, I mean, that suggests that in Belgium, if those people are formally employed, they might have better work circumstances. But if they're in the informal sector, then they're potentially working, 2 hours one session, and then they're not paid to travel to the next one. And if they're late, it's their fault. And then they're probably being asked to pay to do the care at the same time of the day for all of them. So how do you even begin to kind of unpack that? Because I know, I mean, like you say, Understanding Society won't tell you that. There's no survey out there that I'm aware of that would tell you what the workers themselves are experiencing. So it's kind of a challenge, an impossible challenge I've set you.
Yeah, like we got like throughout the whole story of this research project was wrestling with the data, and like we went through like a month-long investigation of the Mexican family life survey because we thought we might be able to use it, and then the data was just super bad. So there's like, we ended up with this triangulation because we were like, this is reasonably good. It's not capturing everything. It's definitely like, that's why I first say as the last word of caution, I was like, especially exactly what you're talking about, like the implication of gig-based like split labor. Like, are you actually being paid for that labor? Like all of it, all of that entails the transport, the tools, like all of that, or like we don't even know if we're capturing all of it, right? And these calculations there, they're based on full-time domestic workers, right? So people who, like, increasingly, it would seem that we have paid domestic work becomes like a sort of side hustle, right? Like something that people try to do on the side when they need work and so on. We can't capture that. Hopefully we can do it with the innovation panel next year, but not for the moment, I think.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, please.
Yeah, and just quickly on that, although these types of workers really can't be captured through these big surveys, a lot of domestic workers, grassroots unions and charities do collect that from their members, and they have actually successfully used that data to kind of challenge things. Like there still is at the moment an exemption to minimum wage law in the UK, which means that if you're not a member of a family but treated as a family member, you're not entitled to minimum wage. But the Low Pay Commission, loads of the grassroots unions and the charities submitted their evidence, the evidence they collected from the workers that isn't captured by these surveys, and the government has committed to getting rid of that exemption. So a bit of a good news story. But yeah, there is data elsewhere. It's a bit different, and it's not, you can't run regression on it, but it's useful to kind of fill in the gaps.
Okay, and would you like to pose the last question, please?
Sure. Super interesting work, thank you. I had a question, like, do you have any way in the data to control for whether or not this is formal work or if it's declared work? Because I was wondering if there was any underlying story of misreporting to some countries where either it will be a cultural stigma or you would fear retaliation if you're actually saying that you have housework paid, like you pay for housework, but it's actually not formal, right? It's not formalized. So you would basically expect to see higher reporting in Belgium just because of the subsidy system, while you wouldn't find it in like Russia or, I was just wondering if this is something that you definitely cannot account for, but if that would be a story that is worth investigating.
Yeah.
There's nothing in the data, I guess.
I don't see it. Like that was at least that was a bit part of the effort of going through domestic work use, is because domestic workers can underreport as well. And that is one of the problems potentially of expenditure survey data. So like in the Mexican family life survey, the numbers we had for people saying they paid for private services were completely implausible. There's nobody. And so it's likely that when it's phrased that way, in that context, people were reluctant to declare it. I mean, it's a bit of an issue with survey data in general. Like we can only go by what people tell us.
But then that could be an indicator of how much misreport there is for every country, right? Because you have this question for all of them. So you could, if you think that this question is an indicator of misreporting or underreporting, then you can look if it varies across your different countries.
There's nothing to compare it to, though. There's nothing to compare it to, though.
Just between themselves, at least.
But we don't know what's noise and what's signal. There's
Yeah, we
nothing,
don't
there's
know.
no extra, there's no additional variables.
Yeah.
To be fair, I mean, so the ILO data on the number of domestic workers or the share of domestic workers in the labor force, that's just asking people what their primary occupation is. And it's hard to, I mean, there's bound to be errors in that, and primary occupation versus secondary is an issue. We don't capture people, as Marion was saying, people who might just do it as a side gig. But I don't think that particular issue of formal versus informal is going to make much difference there. I don't see why anyone would have an incentive to hide it at that point.
Just Russia is weird, right?
Yeah, that is weird. Yeah. But just one thing, just one little thing that makes me think maybe the data on Russia are correct, is that some qualitative work that we saw, well, basically a report on domestic service in Russia, described it as a high-paying and high-status occupation, relatively speaking. Which is consistent with the idea that it's only a very small number of very rich households that employ people on quite a good wage, which is consistent with both high inequality, which we know, and the low number of households employing, and the very low employment share of domestic workers that we find in the data.
Like to clarify, like to build, just to continue on that, like from what we know of international global elites, like it seems that they basically all use paid domestic work. So when you get to the top 0.001% in whatever country, they're probably using paid domestic work, but we can't look at them with survey data.
Okay. So I think that brings us to the end of this absolutely wonderful seminar. Thank you so much.